Well, there's no more pressing issue than global climate change. And the election of Joe Biden last week has really changed the debate. He's obviously pledged to bring the US back into the Paris Climate Accord. So there's now a powerful new impetus behind renewed global cooperation on this issue. And it's not just the US, because in September, China's Xi Jinping made a remarkable pledge for China to go carbon neutral by 2060 and for China's emissions to peak by 2030. So I think it's fair to say that we're going to see an absolute tidal wave of investment into clean energy technology in the next few years, trillions and trillions of dollars, which is going to be an absolute game changer for innovators in clean energy. And not just for the sort of household names, the giants of the industry like Tesla, but lots of other startups, really exciting UK innovators and innovators around the world who are operating in clean energy. Because as we push towards a net zero economy, it's obviously a huge challenge, but it's also an enormous opportunity for innovators to develop new technologies, new solutions that can potentially be exported around the world. And I think if it has taught us anything, COVID-19 has shown that in the face of an imminent threat, radical action is indeed possible. And in response to the challenge of climate change, leading researchers around the world are working to identify solutions that can help us solve some of the most urgent challenges. So to discuss all of this, I'd like to invite the Telegraph's Hannah Boland, who is going to moderate our next panel on what will a post-pandemic world mean for climate change. Thanks. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Robin, for that great introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. As Robin said, I'm Hannah Boland, a technology reporter at the Telegraph, and I'll be moderating our panel today on what will a post-pandemic world mean for climate change. Unsurprisingly, this year has been dominated by discussion over one crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, but another crisis has been bubbling in the background, and that's been climate change. The discussion today perhaps couldn't be more timely. This Monday, a key UN climate summit had been due to kick off in Glasgow, which it was hoped could lead to further pledges on how we limit global temperature rises. Ultimately, the COVID-19 pandemic meant that event was postponed, but with signs that the world could be returning to some sort of normality next year, now seems a great time to be looking at how we chart a course out of the pandemic and whether this course could have a positive effect on climate change. Joining me today to discuss are two experts on the subject. But just before I introduce the panel, I'd like to remind you that you can send over some questions either on Twitter via the hashtag TechIntel20 or through this feed if you click on the red question mark icon. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two panelists. We have Niki Mardas from global Canopy, a data-driven think tank which targets the market forces destroying nature. Mardas's background is as an entrepreneur, having co-founded 3 successful startups, and since being at global Canopy, he's established its New Forest in Climate Change program. Thanks for joining us. Also with us today, we have Gavin Starks from the independent non-profit group IcebreakerOne, an organisation whose goal is to make data work harder to deliver a net zero future. Starks is a well-known figure in the data sphere, having acted as the CEO of the Open Data Institute and having chaired the Open Banking Standard. Thank you both for joining us today. I guess the first thing it'd be good to kick off with is this idea of how COVID-19 has proved that swift action can be taken to stem a crisis. And as we look to come through the pandemic, what should we be looking at as the key priorities to shift us to a green future? Gavin, what are your thoughts on this? Where do you think our focus should be?
Great. Good morning. It's great to be here. I think we've seen that we've got an imminent threat which has had a global impact in the COVID emergency, and the thing that's harder to see is we also have the climate emergency, and that's likely to have a bigger impact on our economy. So we need to go through a form of transformational change, and quickly. Lots of countries around the world have set national targets. We've also seen cities and regions set more rapid targets, but we don't necessarily have a good roadmap to get there. So one of the things that we're really keen to see is a real shift, a transformational shift in the way that capital flows. And part of the challenge there is we're finally having to effectively internalize externalities. We need to bring the non-financial information into our financial decision making. So our impacts on the environment and the subsequent knock-on impacts on society have a material impact on our economic systems. And the thing that we really need to join up, and the huge opportunity in front of us, is unlocking the data. Actually, it's unlocking data as a continuous flow of evidence that can inform action. And so we're working on a number of different programs to try and bring that data together to help people who are at the front line of decision making, whether that be in a local authority or whether that is an investor, financial decision makers, as to how can they really use this new information to make better decisions, and how can they use this information to hold to account the solutions to provable net zero solutions. Because at the moment we're kind of flying blind. So there's lots of initiatives around the world to say, well, we've got to invest in green. But we haven't really quite got a handle on what green means. So we'd like to unpack some of that today.
And Niki, it'd be great to bring you in here because you work quite closely on the need to access data as well. Could you talk through how you kind of see this problem?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for your invitation. And it's great to see climate change on the agenda this year in this tumultuous year in such a far-reaching and wide-ranging event. So I'll agree entirely with Gavin that we need data, and one of the key areas that we need better visibility, better transparency is in finance. We've got to stop the vast sums that are contributing to climate change and the destruction of nature through better transparency. Some would call it radical transparency. We need radical solutions and more accountability in the system. Almost 2 trillion, a recent report, £2 trillion in lending in 2019 went to high-risk sectors for nature, for the environment, destroying vital ecosystems. And our own work, we focus largely on deforestation. Our own work shows hundreds of billions of dollars, actually close to $1 trillion we cover, going to financing deforestation, which impacts all of us. It contributes to climate change. It destroys species and livelihoods. So we're financing ourselves into extinction, and that's happening right now. I mean, the good news, as others have already said, how can you not see the good news for climate change, whatever your politics, in a president-elect who is looking to rejoin Paris? But he's also said in one of the debates that deforestation is going to be a key issue for a Biden presidency, and it's critical that we bring nature and climate together. They're so intertwined. They are crises of equal proportion and connected crises. And the UK has seen this, has understood this. The UK government in its leadership for COP26 is looking at nature-based solutions to climate change, which has to be the way that we go if we want to avoid, among other things, avoid further pandemics, which we know are linked to the destruction of nature. And just this week, the Chancellor made a big announcement about financial institutions and therefore the economy as a whole having to report on its climate impacts by 2025. A little late perhaps, but it's a transition and bigger companies are going to come online sooner. They're doing the right thing. It's the first country in the G20 to do this. So that's fantastic news for what Gavin and I are both advocating for, more transparency. And technology can really help here, but it's complicated. And it's complicated because of the tremendous complexity and opacity of global supply chains and global finance. It's an incredibly complex system. So just this morning, Roger Harabin was on the Today program talking about our links, in our breakfast, driving deforestation. And the problem is a lot of the companies involved and the financiers involved don't have the data that they need to identify the problem, to enable them to take action, and also, as Gavin said, to hold accountable those that are just flying under the radar. We're fighting blind. And that's why we've developed something called Trace with our colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute, which some of you may have seen on David Attenborough's recent Extinction documentary, which tries to reverse engineer a picture of the global economy and global trade so that we can see where the hotspots are. So those countries like the UK that don't want to be importing deforestation know where to focus. So we need to shine a light on this very complex system, and that's what we've been trying to do. And I think the end game is to get better metrics, and Gavin referred to this, but we need ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance metrics that the finance sector uses. We need those to be not a veneer of sustainability. And I could give examples where, there are environmental sustainable funds that have companies in them because they're in sectors that are not well understood. They're driving impacts today, but the numbers are saying yes. Well, we need the numbers to correlate with reality, and that's the task of the coming weeks, months, and years.
And Gavin, when you look at this issue, where do you think the data has the most impact? Because I know we've been speaking quite a lot around gathering data and kind of the importance of even the Chancellor kind of saying we need to disclose more kind of how people sit on the climate scale. But where could it actually have the most impact? Gavin, you work quite closely with companies on this, don't you?
Certainly. So we're working across a lot of different sectors at the moment. But let me map out some of the opportunities and the threats here. So the opportunity really is to empower decision makers, particularly financial decision makers, to mandate the data flows that they need to prove that things are going to be net zero and enable financial incentives to be applied. We're kind of past the point really where voluntary programs or sort of lean-in programs are fit for purpose. We really need to develop things that have more teeth. So we need pension funds to mandate the data that demonstrates that what their portfolios are net zero. And there's a huge opportunity for consumers to engage here in asking their pension funds, their IFAs, their banks, what is in their portfolios? Are they driving demonstrably to net zero? So there's a risk in here, though, as well of kind of not quite greenwash, but I think we're moving past that, but we're not moving past it quickly enough or far enough. And the announcements this week around TCFD, the new kind of process for reporting financial risks at a financial level, are fantastic, but they don't solve the problem. A lot of the work that we've seen in the past, it ends up generating reports in a PDF file that get looked at after the fact. What we're really keen to see is how are we going to use this information as in an operational context? How are we going to move it to a continuous flow, relevant time decision making? And so the opportunity here, at the same time, we've got this incredible amount of innovation that's happened even in the last 5 to 10 years of access to information we simply didn't have before. So that takes us down to individual sensors that are sitting on assets. So we've got asset level data coming from ships, power plants, railways, farms, factories, water treatments, and so on, as well as satellite information, Earth observation data. We're doing whole Earth observation now. Some companies are doing 3-meter resolution whole Earth observation on a daily basis. So you can actually look at where people are carving new routes into rainforest for vehicles before they've cut the rainforest down. So there's really material data out there. The challenge is it's just not connected. We're really bad at managing our own data. People have been building big data lakes, which are largely stagnant in most cases, but we haven't seen this sort of interoperability of information across all of these different issues, because people are very concerned about lots of commercial issues, intellectual property issues, competitive issues, and national security issues. If we're making available data about national infrastructure, that introduces new potential threats. So what we're doing at the moment to try and address these challenges is, one, we're working directly with industry. So we're working with the large insurance companies, working with Willis Towers Watson, with Aon, Brit Insurance, Lloyd's Register Foundation, on how can we create climate-ready financial products that can demonstrate that they're going to drive net zero behaviors. We're also working across the energy sector right now, taking the principles and practice of open banking, which allows data sharing now across the whole of the banking sector. We're creating that for the energy sector. So we've got an open energy standard that is being developed to enable the secure and safe sharing of energy information across the whole of the sector. And what this unlocking or unpacking of access to data that is sensitive enables is everybody can start to live in confident that they're not losing value by sharing information, and they're not introducing new risks, or at least those risks can be mitigated in the process. And what our hope is here is that through better access to data, people will be able to generate better tools and analytics that can then help us predict what might happen in the future with more accuracy. So I think there's a series of threats and concerns we have right now around, is the data we're getting fit for purpose? I would argue it's not. But the potential here is also vast, but it comes with the kind of issues we've seen in the rest of the web. And as you bring more data to market, it introduces other risks. And we've got to be very cognizant of those as we go forward.
And one thing that I guess this ties into then is something that people have mentioned with the new reporting requirements that the Chancellor mentioned this week, is that not everybody discloses well, and not everybody will be including key data points or kind of up-to-date data. And I know something, Niki, you looked at with kind of tracing and your trace project with deforestation. When you're looking, is it really difficult to actually map these supply chains and work out who is being green friendly and who is not, and kind of looking at where they go through?
Yes, Hannah, it's been really considered until recently to be nigh on impossible given the complexity of the system. And there's been a bit of throwing hands up in the air and saying we can't disclose because we don't have visibility because the system's too complex. And, you know, to a degree that's true, of course, but to a degree that's an excuse and allows us to continue business as usual. So it is complicated, but I think with Trace, we've shown what can be achieved. It's a start. So much more needs to be done on this. And one of the ways that will be achieved is, as Gavin says, by making data open and making it interoperable so that we can connect all these systems to get meaning, and for that meaning to be of value to the key decision makers, particularly in the finance sector, because global capital, of course, creates a cascade and is driving so many of these impacts. So at the same time, we need better disclosure, that's for sure, and mandating it is critical, because otherwise you end up just with the leaders who disclose, and we miss a huge part of the market. So it's, you know, a lot of companies, leading companies, have been calling for this kind of legislation because they want to see a level playing field. But at the same time, we can't just leave it to disclosure. We can't just leave it to what companies tell us, not least because often they don't have the full picture. So we need the kind of innovation that takes a top-down view. We need a sort of test and trace for global trade, achieved in a multitude of ways. Some of them using new techniques, using AI that I think has already been mentioned, to mine big data to reach conclusions about environmental performance. But some of it's simpler than that. And we've brought together for Trace, we've brought together millions of shipping records, trade contracts, millions of customs records, and rebuilt, reverse engineered, if you like, a picture of global trade, which allows us to start seeing where the hotspots are and taking action. So, you know, it's a complex field, but we've shown it can be done. More needs to be done. The technologies are getting better, and as more disclosed information comes online, that will, of course, add to the picture.
And one tool that's been used in other markets to kind of make companies act in a more ethical way has obviously been regulation. It'd be great to hear from you whether you think that we do kind of need new laws around making people hit climate targets that they set for themselves. Gavin, do you think that there is a role for regulation here, and do you think the government should be looking at what they can do?
Yes, I do. I think it's a critical component. I think, you know, our part of our position here is that the time for theory is over. And I think, are we going for change as usual or breakthrough? And I think the consensus from my perspective is that we need transformational change, and we all struggle with transformational change. until it's imposed upon us. Now, COVID has demonstrated that with the right kind of emergency, if you like, and the right kind of threat, the political system can act to force things to happen, and the economic systems can act to force different types of behaviors. And there's going to be a loop, I think, coming out of the COVID responses as to what the art of the possible could be. And it's not a small task ahead of us. We spend $3 to $4 trillion per annum globally on infrastructure. We need all of that infrastructure to be demonstrably net zero starting this decade, by 2030. So how we get there is the question, not if we can get there. The consequences of not getting there for everybody, whether it's an economic analysis or social analysis or an environmental analysis, is not good. And we need to kind of build on and enable the financial systems to invest in different approaches. And so at the heart of investment decisions, there's a quantification of risk. And there's a lot of blockers to being able to drive behaviors to investing in net zero solutions, simply because the risk profiles are too high. So, for example, if you want to insure an electric vehicle right now, it's typically about 20% more than insuring a regular vehicle. We need to invert that. We need to invert the pricing models. And the triggers for the investment community, if you look at the banks, for example, there's so much regulation around what people are allowed to invest in that it's actually constraining them. Now, those constraints exist for very good reasons. For a pension fund, you need to make sure that you're looking at that long-term risk. But our argument at the moment is that climate isn't priced properly into those long-term analyses. Ditto with most large-scale investments, and ditto with insurance. And you're starting to see the investment community shift. So BlackRock, for example, the chief executive there is strengthening their sustainability integration into active investment processes. So they're making their portfolio managers accountable for appropriately managing exposure to ESG risks and documenting them. And now that's a shift in how people are going to start investing. But it really is, there's no part of our financial ecosystem that won't be impacted by this. And our regulators need to step into this, I think, in a very proactive way to look at what are the opportunities. What we've seen just in terms of pure data sharing, the opportunities that have emerged out of open banking is there are now 300 or 400 companies signed up to the open banking standard from the fintech communities who are making new products and services, and the regulator played a critical role in enforcing the data exchange to be possible. And so here what we're trying to do is encourage, initially through voluntary standards, but ultimately we would like to see regulated standards that force the data sharing in secure ways that are market relevant to help drive these decisions towards net zero. So I think that's kind of the heart of the opportunity is we've got to use this information to really drive decisions at scale very rapidly. And the regulators are a critical tool in the suite of things that we have to do to move things forward.
And Niki, what's your take on this? Are you hopeful about the current state of play? We've obviously got Biden probably going to be president. Climate appears like it might be back on the agenda, and people talking about a green recovery. Do you think the current pledges that we've got in place are enough to make enough of a difference? And do you think people are actually starting to see the importance of data, or do you think more kind of needs to be done on this?
So I think the opportunity is huge, as you say, because not just because we have President-elect Biden on his way into the White House, but because finance, business have moved dramatically. I mean, when we first came into this space 12 years ago, looking at these precise issues related to data and deforestation, we were talking to companies who really did not understand, hadn't looked at their relationship, how they were driving very serious impacts on forests and on climate. So we've seen a tremendous change where those same companies that we walked through the door with 10, 12 years ago are now the leaders pushing the envelope and calling for stronger measures, stronger legislation. And, we've seen a possible, the Amazon fires in what we do, were critically important last year in raising the issue up the agenda. You had over 250 financial institutions, major investors, saying, not for us, we don't want to be associated with this. Of course, they lack the data to ensure that they're not. So the political opportunity is there. And maybe just to build on something that was said before around the risks of disclosing some of this information. And of course, there are real risks, and that needs to be taken seriously. But a recent World Economic Forum report points to 44 trillion in economic value generation. That's half the global economy, half global GDP, being dependent on nature that we're destroying. The risks here of inaction are so tremendous that we need to rethink some of the fundamental assumptions about what can and can't be shared. And as technology pushes more information into the public domain, those that hold some of this information and are holding it tight for competitive or commercial reasons will find that events have overtaken them because there's more information necessarily than they even had themselves. And so I think openness is the way forward with, of course, the provisos that have been introduced. But we've got lots of instances. The EU, a great leader on climate change, climate legislation, doesn't make available its trade data that we would need to map trade flows coming into the EU. You might say, well, that's a competitive issue, a security issue. Well, the US and China both make that data available. So there's really not an argument for not sharing some of this information, which is absolutely critical to our ability to make progress. And do we need legislation? We do need legislation. Why? Because the leaders can move forward, take us a lot of the way, but we need the entire market to change. And that's not going to happen unless we have the regulators and governments involved. And the big companies, this is critical. The big companies, the investors are calling for that. They're behind that. So I'm in that sense, I'm very hopeful.
And I think we're probably getting near the end of the time. But Gavin, just on one point that Niki was speaking around there, that I think is quite interesting, is around this need for companies to be looking at this. But obviously, we're coming out of COVID, and there are lots of companies, particularly in the airline space, that are maybe thinking we need to invest in staff at the moment. We need to kind of protect jobs. We can't be investing heavily in green tech, or if insurance becomes more expensive because we start pricing in climate stuff, that could be really difficult for them. What's your answer to that?
So I think we just need to reflect on, creating the Industrial Revolution. We spent multiples of our GDP, and the idea that we're going to somehow kind of do change as usual to iterate into a zero carbon future, I think is kind of magical thinking. I think what we need is to take the view of, it's kind of a combination of the Marshall Plan plus an Apollo mission level of ambition here, and that's certainly echoed in a lot of the international political scene. But how we instrument that is really critical. People will not move unless the right regulations are in place, unless the right drivers are in place, unless the right incentives are in place. And we can't really manifest really material change unless we've got the evidence to back it up, because we will fall foul of people holding each. Was that investment driving to net zero? Did it create the right outcomes? But so the opportunity here, though, is, and the kind of work that we're embarking on with this national program, or European program, in fact, around net zero economic recovery from COVID, is if you were going to pick a region of the country where you've got a high possibility to switch transport, for example, to net zero, what's the job profile and what's the ecosystem you need to invest in there to create the future economy? So if we wanted to transition a region to 100% net zero transport and build electric vehicles and provide the net zero energy, renewable energy infrastructure there on a local level, and then train people on how to do retrofits of buildings and so on, there's huge amounts of opportunities to reskill and build the future, which if we invest in now, we'll reap those rewards in the coming decades. The alternative is if we just go back to business as usual, is we're going to have an increasing set of risks. The balance sheets of these companies are going to become untenable, and at some point we're going to price carbon properly. And so you've got this kind of, on one hand, what's perceived as being a model that will take us back to a flourishing economy, but it's not. We need to really think bigger and think differently about how we're moving forward. And what we want to do here is provide the evidence to back that up quickly, what we would call relevant time decision making. So if we're looking on if people are making quarterly financial decisions, let's incorporate this type of information flow into those decisions to change the risk profiles of what people are doing. And I think as they start to price climate into what they're doing, we're going to see very different outcomes from those analyses. And then the feasibility of investing in new green and net zero outcomes becomes much more tenable as a future for the country.
Yeah, no, well, I think that is a great note to end on, and I'm hopeful for the future after speaking to both of you. So thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been a really insightful discussion.